Hello and welcome to a new video. It's been quite a while since my last one, June in fact, which is quite a while ago. Today we are going to look at places in the Kray twin story. I have covered most of these places before in other videos, but I thought it would be a good idea to put them all together and make a whole new video on them. I suppose it's kind of a Kray tour with Google Street View. We will look at some places and talk about them as we go along. I have missed out some places, especially some of the ones where there is no longer a building to look at or part of the original building. I have included a couple of no building ones, but I didn't want to make the video of just lots of streets of nothing. Some places I will skim over as they have been covered lots before. Places like the Blind Beggar. I may just include it briefly when we talk about the Lion pub, and I won't go into too much detail about Valance Road where Jack McVitie was murdered. The first port of call for us today is the hospitals that the twins were at when they both contracted diphtheria in late 1936. Surprisingly, there is still part of those original hospitals still there. Ronnie and Reggie were 3 years old at the time, and it was the first time that they had been separated as they were sent to different hospitals due to Ronnie becoming more unwell. First we will look at where Reggie was sent, and that was the North Eastern Fever Hospital in Tottenham. This is the main entrance that is pretty much as it was when Reg was sent here, give or take a few bits. This is a picture which was quite a bit before Reggie was there and was taken in 1902. I couldn't find any photos of the hospital closer to the time Reg was there in 1936, but we could probably assume it didn't change much from 1902 to 1936. It's not really known how long Reg was at this hospital, but we do know that he made a good recovery from his illness and was sent back home to the family home at the time in Steen Street. Ronnie Kray really struggled with his illness and became gravely ill and was sent to Homerton Isolation Hospital in Hackney. There is not much left of the original hospital now, but we do know that this part is still intact. Most of the hospital was demolished in 1982, as we can see in these pictures here. Here is a picture inside the isolation ward taken in 1935, so the year before Ron was admitted. Ron was at the hospital for several months when it was decided by the family to take Ron out of hospital and nurse him at home, which they duly did. And Ron did come out of his illness, but didn't quite make a full recovery as it affected his mental health for the rest of his life, as he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, or schizophrenia with paranoia, as doctors call it nowadays. Ron was diagnosed with this a bit later in his life. Charlie Kray Sr. said of Ron's recovery at home, "It was his mother saved his life. If it hadn't been for her and what she had done for him, Ron would have been a goner." Next stop is probably the most visited place in the Kray story, and that is Valance Road. The Kray and Lee's family homes are now long gone. Demolition started towards the end of the 1960s. Luckily, a few remnants of the old Valance Road remain intact to how they were when the Kray and Lee families were living here. Violet and Charlie Kray Sr. moved here from Steen Street in the summer of 1939 at number 178. They were the first of the family to move here, but they were followed shortly after a while by more of the Lee family. Violet's younger brother John lived at number 72 with his wife Maud. Rose Wiltshire, Violet's sister, moved into number 76 with her son Billy. Violet's other sister May moved into 174 with her husband Albert. With Violet Kray's parents also living a few doors down on Valance Road, Lee Corner, as it became to be known, was complete, and they would all live here until they were all moved out towards the end of the 1960s. The flats here across the road are still pretty much the same as when the Krays lived here. You can see them in the background of a home cine film where Reggie is cleaning his car. Even the steps here that lead to around the back of the flats are still unchanged. The railway bridge is pretty much the same, but a few signs and small cosmetic changes. Ronnie and Reggie were always concerned about an enemy or somebody they wronged, shooting them from the railway bridge. This was probably heightened during the tensions with the Richardsons. I suppose it could have been a legitimate concern, as they would be very exposed to it from the bridge. I wonder how often they thought of it as they were heading out of the front door each day. The Krays family home, like the other houses in the small row here on Valance Road, was quite small. It had 2 rooms downstairs and a kitchen. It had a scullery out the back and an outside lavatory with 2 bedrooms upstairs. In Reggie Kray's own words, he said, "I won't mince my words, it was a dump." It is a shame the houses are not still standing, but there was a big drive for slum clearance at the end of the 1960s, as some of the housing in this area were in extremely poor condition. Of course, there is far too many things to talk about here at Valance Road, but we would be spending all day talking about it. But one of the more famous things was, of course, the twins' acquittal, along with Kray firm member Mad Teddy Smith, on charges of demanding money with menaces in April 1965. The twins were welcomed back here, of course, as heroes for getting one over on the law, and lots of photos were taken that day of the Kray family's joyous occasion. This is East House in Hadley in Suffolk, where the twins were billeted during World War II around 1940. It is a large 17th century building in George Street in Hadley, which was owned by a Dr. Arthur Hurrell Style and his wife Claire. This was a huge change for the 7-year-old twins. After the dirt and grime of the East End, they were thrust into a new exciting place of the countryside. In 1970, Claire Styles reflected back on Ronnie and Reggie Kray in an interview. She said, "My first thought was, what horrible little boys, and so they were. They were full of rough and tumble and quite unlike my own children. I recall how vividly, how shocked I was that they could not read. I spent long periods teaching them how to read. When they showed some mastery, I insisted they learned the Lord's Prayer." The twins loved their time here in Hadley and Suffolk, and it would yield an enduring love for the countryside of Suffolk for the rest of their 3 years, visiting quite frequently. Charlie Kray also joined Ron and Reg in Hadley and was now in his teens, and he found work in a fish and chip shop and later as a tea boy in a local factory. Like Ron and Reg, Charlie also loved the countryside. Here we have a building that was the North London Magistrates Court on Stoke Newington Road. The twins and others appeared here in 1950 at the age of 16 due to a fight outside Barry's Dance Hall in Narrow Way in Hackney, which ended with a man, Roy Harvey, being seriously injured and nearly dying. Roy Harvey was hit with various items, including a bicycle chain. Also at this incident looking on was Dennis Seigenberg, also known as Dennis Stafford, who would later be given a life sentence for the murder of Angus Sibbott in Newcastle in 1967. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were arrested and appeared here on charges of GBH. The case was eventually sent to the Old Bailey, where Reggie admitted he and Ron took part in the scuffle. He said, "I saw my brother Ron striking a fellow in the face. I joined in and also struck this fellow and another fellow in the face. I did not use any weapons in the fight. I saw one man lying on the pavement, but I'm not sure if it was one of the men that I hit. The Krays and others were eventually acquitted of the GBH charges, thanks to the testimony of the twins' local vicar, Father Hetherington. While we're on old courthouses, we will have a look at the building that was Old Street Magistrates Court, formerly called the Old Street Police Court in Old Street. The twins first appeared here for the assault on a police officer called PC Donald Bainton in Mansford Street in Bethnal Green. For this incident, the twins were given 2 years probation and let go. The Krays also appeared here in January 1965, along with firm member Teddy Smith, charged with demanding money with menaces from a club owner called Hugh McCowan. It was put for trial at the Old Bailey, where the twins and Teddy Smith were eventually acquitted, hence the photographs taken at Valance Road we spoke about when they got a hero's welcome back in Bethnal Green. Ronnie Kray was also supposed to appear here at Old Street Magistrates Court on the 24th of November 1966 regarding a police corruption case which involved a police officer called Leonard Townsend, who was charged with 2 counts of trying to gain £50 from Ronald Kray on 2 occasions in the Baker's Arms public house on the 11th of August 1966. Of course, Ronnie never showed up to the hearing here at Old Street's Magistrates Court. Giving evidence in court went against all that Ronnie Kray stood for, even if it was giving evidence against the police officer. A warrant was put out for Ronnie Kray's arrest on the 13th of December 1966 for not giving evidence in this case. So Ron went into hiding until it all blew over. This was at the time of the Frank Mitchell escape from Dartmoor Prison in December 1966, hence Ron's absence from actually going to visit Frank Mitchell in the flat that Frank was hidden in Barking Road. While we are here at Old Street Magistrates Court, I will just show you Hugh McCowan's Hideaway Club building in Gerrard Street, Westminster. The club was taken over by the Krays after the 1965 trial and renamed El Morocco, which had a lavish opening night with plenty of photographs taken as always and attended by celebrities. It was a slap in the face for the police, who had just seen the twins and Teddy Smith acquitted of all charges of demanding money with menaces at the Old Bailey. Also on this note, this is a brief look at Great Cumberland Place, where the Hideaway Club owner Hugh McCowan lived, at number 23 in flat 8. I can't actually find number 23. 24 is here, but I can't find 23. But this is the plush looking Great Cumberland Place. Reggie Kray did visit here to see Hugh McCowan during that time. The twins were demanding money off him. Apparently, Hugh McCowan's flat was full of fruit machines, and he would hand guests cups full of shillings on entry to the flat to play the machines. Commercial Street Police Station was in this building in Shoreditch before its closure in 1970. It is known quite a bit for the Jack the Ripper case, the hunt for Jack the Ripper, where a lot of officers were based here. It's also where Nipper Read was asked to start an investigation into the Kray firm on the 27th of July 1964. Chief Superintendent Frederick Gerard told Nipper Read, "I want you to get a little team together and have a go at the Krays." This in turn eventually led to the Krays' arrest for demanding money with menaces in the Hugh McCowan hideaway case, of which they were acquitted. It wasn't until 1967 that Nipper Read would have another go at nailing them. Commercial Street Police Station was also used for the identification parade after the murder of George Cornell in 1966, where Ronnie Kray and Ian Barry attended. 2 witnesses were called to try and identify the men in the George Cornell shooting at the Blind Beggar in March 1966, but neither men could make a positive identification. The barmaid of the Blind Beggar, who also witnessed the shooting, was called to attend, but she lost her nerve and failed to show up. Ronnie and Ian Barry were released. Ronnie Kray said of his time that day in Commercial Street Police Station, "They looked after me all right. I had sausages and mash, and another time pie and beans and chips, and there was tea when I wanted it. Mr. Butler told me if they wanted to see me again, he would get in touch." Reggie, who was held at another police station over the Cornell shooting, chimed in. "It's getting a bit strong, the coppers involving us in all this. Our mum has been very worried about all of this. It's her birthday today. She's 56, so we will be having a little drink to cheer her up." This next one is of a place that isn't there anymore. I'm trying to keep the buildings that are not there to a minimum, but this place was quite important in the twins' story, as it is where they started to get a bit of a name for themselves, and this was the location of the Tottenham Royal Ballroom, 415 to 417 High Road, Tottenham. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 2004. Here's some pictures of what it was like when the twins and their friends would have visited the place. The twins frequented the Royal around 1951, where they met eventual firm member Billy Frost here. They would also meet the Webb brothers here, Billy and Ronald Webb, who were local Tottenham villains. They met each other over some trouble with each other, actually, when the Webbs insulted the twins' cousin Rita one night in the Royal. A large-scale battle could have broken out that night between the East and North London gangs, but when an apology was given to Rita in front of the whole crowd in the ballroom by the Webbs, it did calm the situation. Billy Webb said of the Krays later in his book called Running with the Krays, "At first I never paid them a lot of attention and thought of them as a couple of actors trying to impress people. All night long they sat poker-faced and glaring at everyone. They had their own little gang that was close at hand, which proved that they didn't then, and they would never, have the courage to have a fight on their own." After this incident, the Webbs and the Krays were kind of on cordial terms until they would later fall out in what was called the Battle of the Old Horns in early 1968, which we will get to later. This is the site of where the Regal Billiard Hall once stood. I have seen that it said it was further up the street, but I firmly believe it was situated here, tucked in behind the back of the shops here in Eric Street in Mile End. The place was a popular haunt of the twins and their friends, including long-term friend Dickie Morgan, after they were discharged from the army in 1953. The billiard hall was opened by Samuel Morgan in 1952. By the end of 1954, the Krays had basically taken over the Regal Billiard Hall, paying £5 a week for it and borrowing money off their older brother Charlie to smarten the place up. They would keep the money from the snooker tables and the refreshments bar, giving Samuel Martin a cut of the earnings. The twins were 21 at this stage. The Regal is one of the most important places in the Kray story, and it's a shame the building is long gone. This is where the formation of what we all know as the firm took place. Many of the people that came here and met the twins would all be inducted into the Kray firm, and some would stay with the twins almost until its demise in the late 1960s, but some would break away from the firm in the mid-1960s when things got a bit crazy. People that got friendly with the Krays during this early important period of time would be people like Colin Duke Osborne, who was from a respectable Westminster family. His nickname Duke was reference to his gentlemanly manners, and who became one of Ronnie Kray's lovers. The Berry brothers, who would later run the Old Horns, were about in the Regal days, as was Eddie Alford, Pat Butler, the ever-huge Tommy the Bear Welch, also known as Tommy Brown. Harry Abrahams would also be friendly with the twins around this time. Abrahams had his own little firm that included a later key member of the Kray firm, Albert Donahue. Later arrivals during the time the twins were at the Regal would be people like Mickey Fawcett and Johnny Davis. As well as the takings from the billiard hall, there was also a used car lot on the site, also to give the twins a bit of extra income. A Maltese gang famously tried to muscle in on the Regal by wanting protection money from the Krays here, but it was quickly nipped in the bud by the twins. It was depicted in the 1990 film The Krays, with one of the Maltese gang having his hand impaled over the pocket of a snooker table. In reality, Ronnie chased them out of the Regal with a sword that was kept behind the bar. As the Maltese fled in a car, Ronnie lashed out with the sword, smashing the windows of the car, and that was the end of any threat from the Maltese. There are still some buildings here from the time of the Regal in the 1950s. This telephone exchange building was here as it's seen in the 1947 film It Always Rains on Sundays. It is the building on the left of this image from the film. Also, this building on the corner of Eric Street, which was a bank, can also be seen from the film, but it is difficult to make out. The pictures from the film, incidentally, is of Mile End Arena, which was situated just behind where Mile End Underground Station is now. The Mile End Arena is where the Krays had their early boxing matches in their short-lived boxing careers. A brief one here with not much to say, but this is for Cobb Street where Ziggy's Cafe was situated. It is the building that is now Fancy Goods. The twins frequented here around the time of the billiard hall, and it is situated about 2 miles away from Eric Street. This is where the twins encountered Jack Spot and Moisha Blue Boy dressed as Chicago-style gangsters walking through a parted crowd. This made a big impression on the twins, and especially Ronnie. The Krays would later work with Jack Spot briefly before aligning themselves with Spot's rival Billy Hill years later after Jack Spot's demise. I will just touch on this briefly, even though it is a big part of the Krays, but there is nothing to really see here. But it was the site of the Double R Club at 145 Bow Road. The twins' time here overlapped with the billiard hall at the end of the 1950s, and eventually the twins and the firm fully decamped to the Double R after the demise of the billiard hall in Eric Street. There is lots to talk about here, but I will skip it as there isn't much to look at now. What we will look at though is 1A Campbell Road, which as you can see is basically just across the road from where the Double R Club was situated. This was the site of the Anglo-Pakistani Club. The building was owned by Anwar Haig, and the building was leased to Stephen Martin in 1957. Stephen Martin was the father of Charlie and Terry Martin. Terry Martin was assaulted by Ronnie Kray and Bobby Ramsey a year earlier in 1956, where Ronnie was sent to prison for 3 years. Being so close to the Double R Club, Reggie took this as an insult, and according to Reg, he had the Anglo-Pakistani Club firebombed to drive the Martins out. Obviously, he blamed the Martins for Ronnie Kray's imprisonment. The real story, though, is that 8 men turned up and assaulted the barman, causing £35 worth of damage to the club. Stephen Martin went to the police on his suspicions on the attack on the club being instigated by Reggie Kray, but he later withdrew any allegations against Reg, saying, "I have given the matter some further thought, and I have decided that I do not wish the police to take any further inquiries in the matter, as I feel if I take it further, it may cause more trouble from the people responsible. Obviously, this was some blatant intimidation tactics by Reggie Kray. This kind of intimidation would serve Reg and Ron very well going forward into the 1960s, as it was deployed on countless occasions. And this is what contributed to what was called the wall of silence that built up around the Krays when future allegations were made during their criminal career. Reggie eventually struck a deal with the owner of the building, Anwar Haig, and renamed the club Anwar's, and he mentions that in his last interview.
How old were you then?
About 23, but I had the double R club, the Billiard, a little gambling club, Anwar's it was called, in Bow, and I had about 4 of them, all in a radius of a mile.
While we're on the subject of the Martin family, I will slip in a little look here at the Britannia pub where Ronnie and Bobby Ramsey and others assaulted Terry Martin. It is at 44 Morris Street in Shadwell, and this street looks like it would have been hardly changed from that day in 1956, bar a few new builds behind the site of the pub and some businesses under the railway arches. As we leave the 1950s behind, we will now move into the 1960s, which would be the last decade the Krays would spend as free men, and when they were at their most violent and powerful. We stay in the vicinity of the Double R Club and also Eric Street and go to 106A Marlin Road, which was the site of the Kentucky Club that the twins had after the Double R Club. This is the distance from where the Double R Club was situated to where the Kentucky Club was situated, so it's very close by. This is also the distance from where the Regal Billiard Hall was to the Kentucky. I will also add the distance from the Billiard Hall to the Double R, so you can get an idea of how close these clubs were to each other. The Krays did have Esmeralda's Barn around the time of the Kentucky, but there's nothing to see at the site of where the club stood in Wilton Place in Knightsbridge, as it's now home to the 5-star Berkeley Hotel. I will add a clip from the 1966 film The Sandwich Man, which features the building that housed Esmeralda's Barn. Esmeralda's was another very important place in the Kray story, and it don't feel right glossing over it, but I think we will here. The Kentucky Club was situated here at 106A Mile End Road, and the twins opened the club in late 1961. The most famous night here, of course, was the after party of the premiere of the film Sparrows Can't Sing on the 27th of February 1963. Some scenes from the film were filmed in the club, and one scene featured Kray firm members Limehouse Willie and the huge Pat Connolly. The film premiere was held just across the road from the Kentucky at the ABC Empire Cinema. The twins didn't attend the screening, and despite the rumours, the twins did not appear in the film. The twins were asked by the mayor of Bethnal Green, Robert Hare, if they could sell tickets for the premiere, and they took £500 worth of tickets. Apparently they sold them all. Proceeds of the premiere were in aid of the Docklands Settlement Charity, whose patron was Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was due to attend the premiere, but she couldn't as she was suffering from the flu. But her husband, Anthony Armstrong Jones, did attend, and also celebrities including Roger Moore and Charlie Drake attended. Reg fondly remembers the after party at the Kentucky years later in the book Our Story by Fred Dinage. It was on the night with me and Ron done up like dogs' dinners in our bow ties and dinner jackets that I realised we were well on the way to making it to the top. I felt so powerful that night. I felt like nothing was going to stop us. The good times were back for the Kray twins, and by Christ, we did have some good times and some good laughs at the Kentucky. Despite the glamour of the Kentucky, extreme violence was also not very far away. Ronnie slashed a man across the face in the toilets of the Kentucky for suggesting that he needed to go to the country as he was putting on a bit of weight, meaning get a bit of exercise. A throwaway, jokey comment that caught Ronnie on a bad evening. Another evening, and Ron may have laughed it off, but on this occasion, it ended in violence with a slashed face, and the man was given the name Tramlines after due to the scar left by the wound. Out by Kingston Bypass in New Malden stands the building that during the early part of the 1960s housed the Cambridge Rooms. The Krays became partners in this place. This is the place where at a charity event the Krays raffled off a horse called Solway Cross, which was said to have been brought by the twins for their mother Violet. It wasn't a very good racehorse and it probably cost them too much money to keep, so they decided to put it in a raffle here at the Cambridge Rooms. It was said the horse was won by the actor Ronald Fraser. The Cambridge Rooms was also where the Krays and the firm took heavyweight boxer Sonny Liston to in 1963. There is 2 dates given on this. Some say 1963, others say 1965, but I do believe it to be 1963 that Sonny Liston was with the twins at the Cambridge Rooms, because Sonny Liston was on a UK tour that year. The Krays would frequent the Cambridge Rooms often. It was a bit out of the way, so a good place for an undisturbed meet. The Krays eventually drifted away from the Cambridge Rooms, like they did with most places they had a hand in, but the building still stands today. This big white building here at 228 to 230 Bethnal Green Road used to be the Greengate Public House. It is here that Reggie said Ronnie appended a few fellas who was making fun of Ron behind his back, and he knocked them out, and then Reggie slung them out onto the pavement outside. This is one of Reggie's memories of Ron when he gave an interview on a news channel after Ronnie's death in 1995. This is the only story that I know of about the Greengate pub involving the twins, and the pub closed in 1995. It's not beyond reason to think that the twins and the firm visited the pub on more occasions, as it was only a short walk from the Kray family home in Valance Road, as we can see here. We have been going in kind of chronological order so far. Some of the places next will just be dotted about here and there with no real order. We will take a brief look at Cedral Court in Stoke Newington, where Ronnie and Reggie both had flats. Reggie's flat was flat 1 on the ground floor, and Ronnie's flat was flat 8 on the first floor, directly above Reggie's. Ronnie was the first to move into the flats in the summer of 1962, and a year later Reggie moved in the summer of 1963. Frances Shea also lived here with Reggie in his flat. I don't know if it was all the time, but she was certainly here some of the time. Ronnie's flat at Cedral Court became a hub for homosexual activity and parties, where Reggie was also a frequent visitor at these parties. Frances would stay downstairs in Reggie's flat and hear what was going on. It must have been a complete nightmare for her at the time. Mentally fragile, this would not have been the best place for somebody so young and ill. Reg would also often be drunk when he returned to the flat. We also have the iconic photos of the twins strolling through Cedral Court, taken by the Daily Express on the 5th of August 1964. This was taken at the height of the Boothby scandal. As we mentioned the Boothby scandal, this is One Eaton Square in Mayfair, which was the home of Lord Boothby during the Ronnie Kray and Boothby scandal. It was here that the famous photographs were taken of Boothby, Ronnie Kray, Teddy Smith and Leslie Holt. Ronnie went to the flat to discuss the Onugu project that the twins were involved in Nigeria. Boothby declined the offer being made about him coming on board with the project, but his acquaintance with Ronnie Kray did not stop there, as we all know. This is 2 Manchester Grove on the Isle of Dogs. This is the house that Dr. Blasker had his surgery, who was Ronnie Kray's doctor throughout his life. It is said he was the doctor for Gangland, London, stitching up wounds and removing bullets to keep villains out of hospitals where they would face awkward questions. Blasker supplied Ronnie with his medication to keep his mental health as stable as possible throughout his life. Dr. Blasker died on the 28th of December 1974, aged 70. He was at work on the day he died, but was taken ill and never recovered. His obituary in the British Medical Journal described him as a unique character in the East End of London, devoted to his work. It is said he never took a holiday. In 2010, a campaign run by 2 ladies, Daisy Woodard and Bessie Boyler, resulted in a new Riverside Road being named Blasker Walk after their much-loved doctor, Dr. Blasker. They also organised a substantial fundraising effort which paid for kidney machines to be donated in his name to the Royal London Hospital. This is the site of the 66 Club in Upper Street, Islington, also known as the Tudor Club. It was situated here at 66 Upper Street, where the pink entrance is, and was owned by the Till family. As we know, the Tills, Bobby, David and Alfie, were on the Kray firm. In the case of David and Alfie Till, this was from the days of the Double R Club right through until the twins' arrest in 1968. Bobby hung around with the firm a little bit later into the 1960s, early 1960s. The 3 brothers gave evidence against the Krays and the firm at the Old Bailey trial in 1969. The twins came to this place quite often, and especially Ronnie. It was out of the way to their usual haunts around Bethnal Green and the West End, so it was a good place to have a meet and an undisturbed, quiet drink. The Till brothers said that once the Krays and the firm got a foot in the door, they basically took over the place. That kind of thing was typical with the Krays, and it happened at many other places they frequented. By the later years of the 1960s, the Tills closed the club, and the Tills firmly blamed the demise of the club on the Kray firm, which is probably true. 240A Amherst Road, Stoke Newington, is the building that housed the Regency Club, which figured quite a lot in the story of the Krays. It was owned by the Barry brothers, Tony and John Barry, who seemed reluctantly on the fringes of the Kray firm. I suppose you could call them associates. The twins were getting protection money from the Regency, and they seemed to be in there a lot in the later half of the 1960s, right up until their arrest in May 1968.
The Regency Stoke Newington lost thousands to the Krays. It began with nipping, that's to say running up vast bills for food and drink which they knew the owners would never dare ask them to pay. Tony and John Barry, joint owners of the Regency, described the night members of the firm came to put them on the pension.
Broke the doors in to get in. They're downstairs. Alan went down to see what it was all about, and they got hold of him right away and gave him a clamp with a gun, pushed the gun up his nose, and they said, "Get hold of Johnny Barry, we want to speak to him. You're going on a pension scheme." I said, "Well, what's it all about?" I said, "Pension scheme." He said, "You're going to pay £50 a week." So I said, "Right, no, I thought there's going to be some trouble here, you know what I mean?" I said, "All right, lovely, I said, "I'll pay it." I said, "This house got a V." I said, "Let's have a drink," because I was frightened at what I was going to do. And as I'm talking, one of the firms got the gun on Alan, and he said, "If you don't pay," he said, "we're going to shoot one of your men every week." He said, "You can go now," he said, "if you want to be funny." So I said, "Legal." I said, I said, "Let's have a drink." I said, "I'll pay it." I said, and that's the end of it.
The club is most famous for being the place Jack McVitie was before being lured to a basement flat in Everingham Road, just a short distance away, and set upon by the twins and some members of the firm, having first a gun put to his head which failed to go off, and eventually being stabbed to death by Reggie Kray. Tony Barry paid a price for reluctantly playing a part in the murder of Jack McVitie when he appeared with the Krays and the firm at the 1969 trial. Tony Barry was acquitted of being an accessory to the murder of Jack McVitie, but the club suffered for this, and by 1970 the Barry brothers owned Regency was pretty much finished.
Our club got ruined after the trial. Within a matter of about months, the police revoked the licence and put us out of business.
It's like the association, the smear it rubbed off on us, you understand? 1970, that was it, it was all over.
We will briefly take a look at 97 Everingham Road, where Jack McVitie was murdered in the basement, and just a short distance away, here is the railway bridge that some of the firm present were told to dump McVitie's body after the murder, chuck him over the bridge onto the train tracks. Just while we are here in Everingham Road, we will look at 113 Everingham Road, just a few doors down, which at the time of the Jack McVitie murder, firm member Big Pat Connolly was living here. He rented a room from Winnie Harwood after splitting up from his wife. Pat Connolly was at the party where Jack McVitie was murdered at number 97 Everingham Road, but he did leave with a few others before the murder took place. Also, while we're on the Jack McVitie case, we will have a quick look at the house he was living in at the time, 42 Hartland Road in West Ham. It's the house with the brown door. This is the distance from Jack's home to where he ended up at the Regency Club on the night he was murdered, so about 5 miles away. Jack left his house late in the afternoon that day to never return. Keeping with the Kray victims, we will look at Masterman House in New Church Road, Camberwell, which was the home of George Cornell at the time of his murder in March 1966. He was living here with his wife Olive and his 2 children. He left his flat at 6:30 p.m. on the evening of his murder, and like Jack McVitie, never returned home. The Lion Pub in 8 Tap Street was here in this building, owned by a woman called Margaret Joseph. She was known as Madge, and the pub became known as the Widows due to her being a widow after her husband John had died. It was here that Ronnie Kray was drinking before going to the Blind Beggar to shoot George Cornell, who later died from his injuries. Ronnie was accompanied by Ian Barry, who was the second shooter who fired bullets into the ceiling, and John Dixon, also known as Scotch Jack. He drove the 2 men to the Blind Beggar pub. This is the distance from the Lion in Tap Street to the Blind Beggar pub. This, of course, is the Blind Beggar public house where Ronnie Kray shot George Cornell in March 1966. After the shooting, Ronnie, Ian Barry and John Dixon drove back to the Lion pub where they met other members of the Kray firm, and they all decamped, eventually ending up here at Checkers at 145 High Street, Walthamstow. I think they also stopped at the Stowe Club that was managed by firm member Limehouse Willie just before they went to Checkers. The firm gathered here at Checkers around a radio, waiting for updates on the shooting, and the news came through later that night that the victim had died. After the murder, Ronnie Kray and Ian Barry lived in a flat above a barber's called A. Adams Barbers. They were waiting for the heat to settle down after the Cornell murder. The flat is here, just above the Al Medina shop. With information garnered from Kray firm member and police informant Bobby Till, the police knew that the firm would be meeting here on the night of the 4th of August 1966. At 1:50 a.m, a team of officers broke into the flat, disturbing one of Ronnie Kray's drinking parties, and Ronnie, Reggie and Ian Barry were taken into custody at Commercial Street Police Station, but they were of course all later released. Ian Barry was also arrested in Leabridge Road for the final time on the mop-up of the Kray firm in 1968. This is the site of where Churchill's restaurant and club was at 160 New Bond Street. Lisa Prescott worked here. Lisa Prescott was the woman who was taken from the club by Reggie Kray and Tommy Cowley to the flat in Barking Road, where escaped prisoner Frank Mitchell was hiding out. It has been said that Lisa worked at Churchill's at the time, and it has been said she worked at Winston's, which was another club here in Bond Street. The confusion of Winston's and Churchill's probably becomes more understandable if you know that Churchill's was originally set up by Bruce Brace and Harry Meadows with the active involvement of Billy Howard. Harry Meadows eventually gained sole control of the venture, with Bruce Brace and Billy Howard setting up across the street at Winston's. They'd lost a lot of money when Harry Meadows eased them out of Churchill's, so they gave their next venture a similar name to wind him up, which was of course called Winston's. Lisa Prescott worked at both clubs, but I do believe that at the time of her getting involved with the Krays and Frank Mitchell, she was working at Winston's, which would have been across the road here. Author John Pearson says it was Churchill's and Winston's in two different books about the Krays. We will just look here briefly at the block of flats where Frank Mitchell was kept with Lisa Prescott, with members of the firm keeping watch. Mitchell was taken from this flat on Christmas Eve 1966 and shot to death in the back of a van. I think we will look at two more places before we finish up the video. The first is the site of the Old Horns pub at 68 Warner Place in Bethnal Green. This place saw a hive of activity by the Krays in the months leading up to their arrest and the demise of the Kray firm. The twins and the firm were here on their final night of freedom before moving on to the West End to go to the Astor Club, with author John Pearson in tow, who was at the time with the twins on and off while researching his book that he was going to write about them that turned out to be The Profession of Violence. The other big thing that happened here, by the twins being here on their last evening of freedom, was the fight that was dubbed the Battle of the Old Horns, that involved the Kray firm and Tottenham villains, the Webb brothers, Billy and Ronald. There was probably still a small bit of animosity from the Krays towards the Webb brothers since the very near altercation at the Royal in Tottenham all those years ago, when insults were thrown by the Webb brothers towards the twins' cousin Rita. Violence was avoided on that occasion, but it wouldn't be the case this time. The Webbs went to the Old Horns on the 18th of April 1968 for a business meeting with the twins and the firm. The Krays wanted to come in as partners in some of the Webbs' lucrative schemes that included protection of a smuggler that brought guns and pornography into the country. The Webb brothers were reluctant to go this route, with Billy Webb later saying in his book Running with the Krays, "As could be expected, I would not allow this. Inevitably, a quarrel started as Ronnie Kray assumed I could be persuaded in taking them in as partners. This could not be achieved and a war started. It began when we received an invitation to meet the twins and talk about the business. Many times we had got word that they were anxious to have a meeting with us. My brother Ron and I discussed the possibility of a meeting with the Krays many times, but my brother Ron was against it, and whilst I was not keen, I was also a bit curious. The meeting went ahead, and of course, in true Kray fashion, it soon descended into extreme violence, with the Webb brothers very much outnumbered. Many of the firm were present: Albert Donahue, the three Lambriano brothers, Tony, Chris and Nicky, Tommy Cowley and Scotch Jack Dixon. Suddenly, out of the blue, Ronnie Kray went to hit Billy Webb, and the Webb brothers were soon under heavy assault from Ronnie Kray and the firm. Reggie Kray, for some reason, did not get involved, but the Webbs made their way to the exit under a hail of fists and blunt objects, but they did make it out. Billy and Ronald Webb were in a bad way, with blood streaming down their faces as they made their way to Hackney Hospital. Dr. Mary Murphy, on examination of the Webb brothers at Hackney Hospital, said, "On examination, I found that William Webb had a laceration of the right eyebrow and a laceration of the forehead just inside the hairline, and lacerations to the top of the skull, and a laceration on the left finger ring. He was x-rayed and a number of sutures were inserted into the lacerations. On examination of Ronald Webb, I found he had lacerations at the top of his head and a periorbital hematoma and a subconjunctival hematoma and fragments of glass in his hair. He was x-rayed and then refused to have any of his treatment. His wounds definitely needed sutures. In my opinion, the lacerations caused to these two patients were probably caused by blunt instruments and most likely fists." Billy Webb would never forgive the Krays for the assault and blame that attack in the Old Horns that day on his brother's early death. It was claimed by Billy Webb years later that he punched Ronnie Kray in the face on a visit to Broadmoor to see Ron. I will leave that up to you if you believe that. The final place we will look at is Braithwaite House in Bun Hill Row in Shoreditch. This is where the Kray family moved to after 178 Valance Road, arriving here at the start of 1968. The Kray family had also recently bought a house in Bilston in Suffolk. They would spend some weekends there in the early months of 1968, even entertaining John Pearson there, who was researching the twins for his book. Flat 43 of Braithwaite House became the new centre of operations for the twins and the firm. These type of flats may be a bit of an eyesore now, but in the late 1960s they were very luxurious, and especially after living in a rundown house like 178 Valance Road for 28 years. Things came crashing down here for the Krays when they were arrested on the 8th of May 1968 by a team of detectives led by Leonard Nipper Reid. That morning would be the Krays' last glimpse of freedom, and by 1969 they were serving life sentences with a recommendation of 30 years. During the time of the twins' arrest, their mother and father were away at the country house that they bought in Bilston. Braithwaite House is pretty much unchanged from 1968. Violet Kray and Charlie Kray Sr. continued to live here until their deaths in 1982 and 1983 respectively. I think this will do us for this video. A look at some of the places in the story of the Kray twins, but I will mention some places that I didn't look at. These places are no longer there, so there's no point just looking at lots of streets. These places were Freddie Foreman's pub in Lance Street, which was demolished, the Glenray Hotel in Seven Sisters Road opposite Finsbury Park, which was also demolished, the Shea family home, which is no longer there, in Ormsby Street, and number 40 Gorsuch Street, the house where Charlie Kray Sr. grew up. That's no longer there. I would have missed out some places, but I think we have covered quite a bit here. This is going to be a bit of a long video, but I hope it isn't too long for you all. I'd like to thank you all for watching this video. I really can't tell you when the next one will be, but I'm sure I will do more at some point. I hope you have all enjoyed the video, and I will see you again in the next one. Thank you.